Imagine waking up to a world that feels strangely incomplete. The streets are still there. The cities still hum with electricity. The oceans still rise and fall beneath the moon. Yet something has changed. Not because millions have vanished. Not because trumpets have shattered the sky. But because a question, buried beneath nearly 2,000 years of interpretation, suddenly refuses to stay silent. What if one of the most famous beliefs about the end of the world is not what the earliest Christians imagined at all? What if the image that dominates modern culture, the sudden disappearance of believers from the earth, is not the image that first emerged from the pages of the ancient texts? To investigate that possibility, we must leave behind the familiar landscape of movies, novels, and popular prophecy charts. We must step into a far older world. A world illuminated by oil lamps and haunted by the shadow of the Roman Empire. A world where small communities gathered in hidden rooms, whispering prayers while emperors claimed divine authority. These people were not asking how to escape history. They were struggling to survive it. Somewhere within that forgotten world, an ancient expectation took shape. An expectation so powerful that it transformed grief into hope and fear into anticipation. Yet the closer we look, the stranger it becomes. Because when we open the earliest Christian writings, we do not immediately find detailed timelines of the apocalypse. We do not find believers disappearing into the clouds while the world is abandoned below. Instead, we encounter fragments, symbols, trumpets, voices, a descent, a meeting in the air, images that have inspired centuries of debate, images that raise a deeper question. What exactly did the first followers of Christ believe would happen when their Lord returned? The historical record offers clues. The ancient texts preserve testimony. Theological traditions provide interpretations. But these pieces do not always fit together as neatly as many assume. Some scholars argue that the modern idea of the rapture reflects the plain meaning of Scripture. Others remain unconvinced, insisting that the earliest Christians expected something profoundly different. The difficulty is that both sides appeal to the same ancient sources. And that means before we can ask whether the rapture will happen, we must first confront a more fundamental mystery. Have we understood what those ancient authors were actually trying to say? Tonight, we are not beginning with an answer. We are beginning with a door standing half open in the ruins of antiquity. Beyond it lies one of the most consequential debates in Christian history. And the deeper we follow the evidence, the more uncertain the familiar story may become. To understand how this mystery began, we must leave behind every later tradition and return to the eastern edge of the Roman Empire during the 1st century. The world of the earliest Christians was not a world waiting comfortably for the future. It was a world suspended between hope and uncertainty. Across the rugged hills of Judea, beneath the burning sun of Galilee, and along the crowded trade routes that connected Syria, Asia Minor, and Greece, countless peoples lived under the shadow of Rome. Stone roads stretched across continents. Roman standards flew above cities and fortresses. The emperor's image appeared on coins carried in every marketplace. To many, Rome seemed eternal. Yet beneath this appearance of order, ancient tensions remained unresolved. The Jewish people carried memories older than the empire itself. They remembered prophets, kingdoms, exiles, and promises. Their sacred writings spoke of a future day when God would intervene in history, defeat evil, judge the nations, raise the dead, and establish his kingdom. This expectation shaped the religious imagination of the age. The future was not merely a continuation of the present. It was a coming act of divine restoration. It was within this environment that the Jesus movement emerged. Its earliest followers were Jews who believed that Jesus of Nazareth was the long-awaited Messiah. Yet his execution created a problem that seemed impossible to overcome. Messiahs were supposed to triumph. Crucified men did not establish kingdoms. Then came the claim that changed everything. His followers declared that he had risen from the dead, not as a spirit, not as a memory, but as the beginning of a future resurrection that would eventually encompass all creation. This belief transformed how they understood history itself. They no longer believed they were merely waiting for God to act. They believed God's final plan had already begun. As Christian communities spread across the Mediterranean world, they gathered in homes, workshops, courtyards, and hidden meeting places. They possessed no great temples, no armies, no political influence. Many expected the return of Christ within their own generation. Some members of these communities began to die before that return occurred, and this created a profound theological crisis. If the kingdom was near, what would happen to those who died first? Would they miss the arrival of the Messiah? Would they be excluded from the promises of resurrection? These were not abstract questions. They were questions born from funerals, grief, and uncertainty. Somewhere within this atmosphere of expectation and loss, the earliest discussions about the return of Christ took shape. Not as speculative prophecy, not as a system of end-times charts, but as an attempt to answer a deeply human concern. What happens to the faithful when history reaches its appointed end? The historical record shows that this question stood at the heart of some of the earliest Christian writings. And it is precisely there, within that ancient landscape of empire, longing, and expectation, that our investigation must continue. Now let us set aside arguments, manuscripts, and theories for a moment, and step into the image itself. Imagine standing before a vast sacred mural painted upon the walls of an ancient sanctuary. The pigments have darkened with age. Gold leaf flickers beneath centuries of dust. Yet the scene remains startlingly alive. Above, the heavens are not calm. They are unfolding. Layer after layer of celestial darkness, parts like great curtains being drawn back by invisible hands. Clouds do not drift across the sky. They tower like mountains of silver and fire. At their center burns a radiance so intense that it seems to dissolve the boundary between light and substance. The earth below lies in shadow. Cities, valleys, rivers, and deserts appear small beneath the overwhelming scale of the vision. Then the eye is drawn upward. There, suspended between heaven and earth, stands the central image that has fascinated theologians, artists, and believers for centuries. Figures rise toward the luminous horizon. Some appear wrapped in flowing garments that shimmer like molten ivory. Others are rendered as silhouettes against a field of gold and sapphire. They are neither fully of the earth nor fully of the heavens. They occupy a strange threshold between worlds. Around them echoes the visual language of ancient apocalyptic art. Trumpets gleam like pillars of bronze. Angels descend through concentric circles of light. Their faces are solemn rather than triumphant. Their expressions suggest not celebration, but the execution of a cosmic decree written long before the foundations of the world. The architecture of the vision feels equally unusual. There are no gates of pearl floating in the clouds. No delicate paradise detached from creation. Instead, everything appears connected. Heaven bends downward. Earth reaches upward. The two realms seem to move toward one another as though responding to a force beyond human understanding. Light cascades from above in vast rivers, illuminating mountains, tombs, and forgotten places hidden beneath darkness. The symbolism is unmistakable. This is not merely a picture of movement through space. It is a picture of boundaries collapsing. Ancient artists often portrayed divine encounters through radiance, elevation, and celestial geometry because ordinary language struggled to describe realities believed to exist beyond human perception. In these images, clouds become symbols of divine presence. Trumpets signify royal arrival. Light represents revelation. The sky itself transforms into a sacred threshold where history and eternity meet. Yet there is something deeply unsettling about the scene. The figures ascending are not the true center of the composition. The light is, the throne is, the approaching presence is. The image seems to whisper that the mystery is larger than human destiny alone. It concerns the transformation of the entire cosmos. And as we stand before this symbolic landscape, another question begins to emerge from within the painting itself. Are we looking at humanity leaving the world behind? Or are we witnessing the moment when heaven itself begins to reclaim the world below? The deeper we move into this investigation, the more we encounter an unexpected reality. The controversy surrounding the rapture is not a modern disagreement layered onto an otherwise simple text. It emerges from a much older conflict concerning how history itself is supposed to end. At first glance, the passage in 1 Thessalonians appears straightforward. Paul describes believers meeting the Lord in the air. Yet almost immediately questions begin to multiply. What exactly does this meeting signify? Is it a departure from the world, or the beginning of a divine arrival into it? The historical record shows that generations of readers have answered that question in remarkably different ways. Some interpreters emphasize the language of being caught up and argue that the most natural reading points toward a dramatic removal of believers from earthly events. They see a distinction between God's judgment upon the world and the destiny of the faithful. From this perspective, the meeting in the air functions as a rescue before a period of unprecedented tribulation. The strength of this interpretation lies in its apparent simplicity. It takes the upward movement seriously and constructs a coherent timeline around it. Yet others remain unconvinced. The difficulty with that interpretation, they argue, is that it may isolate a single image from its broader historical and theological context. These scholars point out that the earliest Christian writings repeatedly emphasize resurrection, renewal, and the public return of Christ rather than an escape from creation itself. They note that Paul never explicitly states that believers remain in heaven after meeting the Lord. The text describes the meeting. It says surprisingly little about what happens next. This raises a deeper question. If Paul intended to describe a departure from the earth, why does he not explain it more clearly? The debate becomes even more complex when the wider landscape of ancient Jewish thought is considered. Many Jewish apocalyptic traditions anticipated divine intervention within history rather than the abandonment of history. God's kingdom was expected to transform the world, judge evil, and restore creation. Some scholars therefore argue that the earliest Christians inherited this expectation and reinterpreted it around the figure of Christ. Others caution against drawing conclusions too quickly. They note that ancient apocalyptic language is often symbolic, poetic, and resistant to precise reconstruction. The archaeological record cannot fully answer these questions. No inscription, artifact, or buried manuscript has yet emerged to settle the matter definitively. Instead, historians must weigh literary evidence, cultural context, linguistic clues, and theological patterns. Even among scholars who agree on the meaning of individual passages, disagreement often remains regarding how those passages fit together. One interpretation may explain the imagery of ascent. Another may better account for the themes of resurrection and renewal. Each solves certain problems while creating others, and so the conflict remains unresolved. Not because the evidence is absent, but because the evidence points toward a mystery that may be larger than any single verse. What began as a question about a future event has become a debate about how ancient believers understood the relationship between heaven, earth, judgment, and hope itself. And before we can decide which interpretation stands on the strongest foundation, we must examine the evidence more closely, piece by piece, as if reconstructing a shattered mosaic whose original image has been partially lost to time. As our investigation moves deeper into the textual evidence, we encounter a layer of the story that is rarely discussed outside academic circles. Most debates about the rapture focus on familiar passages found in the New Testament. Yet the intellectual world that shaped those passages was far larger than the biblical canon alone. Hidden behind the texts that survived are echoes of traditions, writings, and interpretations that once circulated among ancient Jewish and Christian communities. Some were preserved, others were lost. A few survived only in fragments buried beneath centuries of history. The strongest evidence for understanding early apocalyptic expectations comes from texts written before and alongside the New Testament. Among these are works such as the Book of Enoch, portions of the Sibylline Oracles, and various Jewish apocalyptic writings discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. These texts do not describe the rapture in the way later generations would imagine it. Instead, they reveal a world saturated with expectations of divine intervention, cosmic judgment, heavenly assemblies, and the resurrection of the dead. The historical record shows that many first-century Jews believed history was moving toward a dramatic confrontation between the forces of order and chaos. Heaven and earth were not viewed as permanently separate realms. Rather, they were dimensions of reality destined to intersect in a future act of divine restoration. This context may help explain why early Christian authors often employed symbolic language that modern readers find difficult to interpret. Yet the evidence is not entirely straightforward. Some scholars argue that these non-canonical texts illuminate the intellectual environment of the New Testament and therefore provide valuable context. Others remain cautious. The difficulty with relying too heavily on such sources is that they do not always represent mainstream beliefs, nor do they necessarily reflect the views of every early Christian community. Similar challenges appear when examining later Christian traditions. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, different theological schools began developing distinct interpretations of resurrection, judgment, and the return of Christ. Some emphasized a future earthly kingdom. Others focused on spiritual transformation. Still others interpreted apocalyptic imagery symbolically rather than literally. These competing perspectives remind us that interpretation was never entirely uniform. Even among ancient believers, debate already existed. There is also an intriguing textual detail hidden within the language itself. The Greek term often translated as meeting in 1 Thessalonians appears in other ancient contexts where citizens leave a city to greet a visiting ruler before accompanying him back into the city. Some scholars see this as a crucial clue. Others argue that linguistic parallels alone cannot determine the meaning of a theological passage. The evidence suggests possibilities, but not certainties. And that distinction is important. The archaeological record cannot tell us precisely how every early Christian interpreted these texts. Lost sermons, unwritten conversations, and vanished communities remain beyond our reach. What survives are fragments, clues scattered across manuscripts, scrolls, commentaries, and traditions. When assembled together, they reveal something remarkable. The earliest discussions surrounding the return of Christ emerged within a rich and diverse landscape of apocalyptic thought. Yet they stop short of providing the kind of detailed roadmap many later readers hope to find. And perhaps that is why the debate continues. The hidden texts do not close the investigation. They expand it. They remind us that beneath every familiar verse lies a deeper world of ideas, expectations, and unanswered questions waiting to be explored. The further we advance into this investigation, the more we discover that the ancient texts may be speaking in a language that modern readers no longer instinctively understand. The imagery surrounding the return of Christ is often approached as if it were a technical description of future events. Yet the historical record suggests that ancient apocalyptic literature functioned differently, communicated through symbols, not because its authors wished to obscure reality, but because they were attempting to describe realities that exceeded ordinary language. To understand the Rapture debate, we must first understand the symbolic world from which its imagery emerged. Consider the clouds. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, clouds rarely function as meteorological details. They are symbols of divine presence. When the Israelites journey through the wilderness, God appears in a pillar of cloud. When Moses ascends Sinai, the mountain disappears into cloud. When prophetic visions depict the arrival of divine authority, clouds often accompany the scene. In this symbolic framework, clouds do not merely indicate location. They signify the boundary between human and divine realms. This raises an important question. When Paul describes believers meeting the Lord in the clouds, is he primarily providing geographical information or invoking a familiar symbolic language associated with divine manifestation? The evidence suggests the latter may play a significant role. A similar pattern emerges with the trumpet. In modern imagination, the trumpet often appears as a dramatic sound effect announcing the apocalypse. Yet, in the ancient world, trumpets carried specific cultural meanings. Archaeological evidence, biblical texts, and historical records show that trumpets announced royal arrivals, military assemblies, sacred festivals, and divine interventions. They were instruments of public proclamation. Their purpose was not secrecy. It was revelation. This detail becomes significant because it challenges interpretations that envision an entirely hidden or private event. Then there is the image of ascent itself. At first glance, ascending into the air appears straightforward. Yet ancient literature frequently uses upward movement symbolically. Mountains represent encounters with God. Ascents signify authority, transformation, or entry into sacred space. In Jewish apocalyptic writings, visionary journeys often involve movement through heavenly realms. Some scholars therefore caution against reading every vertical image as a literal travel itinerary. Others argue that symbolic meaning and historical expectation need not be mutually exclusive. The debate remains open. Perhaps the most fascinating symbol is the meeting itself. The Greek term used by Paul appears in civic and royal contexts where citizens leave their city to welcome a visiting ruler. Literary evidence from the Greco-Roman world reveals that such encounters were often public ceremonies expressing loyalty and allegiance. If that background informs Paul's language, the image may carry political and theological implications far beyond simple movement through the sky. Yet the difficulty with any symbolic interpretation is determining where symbolism ends and expectation begins. Ancient authors did not separate the symbolic from the real in the same way many modern readers do. A symbol could communicate truth precisely because it pointed toward a reality believed to be genuine. This is why the strongest interpretations avoid reducing the imagery to either pure metaphor or pure literalism. The evidence suggests a more complex picture. Clouds signify divine presence. Trumpets announce royal authority. Ascent symbolizes transformation and encounter. Together they form a symbolic architecture designed to communicate something profound about the relationship between heaven, earth, and the return of divine kingship. And as these symbols begin to align, a deeper possibility emerges. Perhaps the central question was never about the mechanics of how believers would rise. Perhaps it was about whom they were rising to meet, and what that meeting meant for the future of creation itself. Every historical investigation eventually arrives at a crossroads where the evidence allows more than one path forward. The debate surrounding the rapture is no exception. Yet among the many interpretations proposed throughout Christian history, one stands apart because of how dramatically it challenges assumptions that many readers bring to the text. It is not necessarily the oldest interpretation, nor is it the most widely accepted, but it forces us to reconsider what the earliest Christians may have believed about the end of history. Some scholars argue that the language of 1 Thessalonians has been misunderstood because modern readers instinctively focus on the direction of movement rather than the purpose of the movement. According to this interpretation, the central event is not believers leaving the earth. The central event is the arrival of Christ as King. In this view, the meeting in the air functions much like a ceremonial reception. The faithful rise to greet the returning ruler and then accompany him as he establishes his reign. This interpretation is sometimes described as the royal arrival or imperial visit reading. What makes it controversial is that it shifts the emphasis away from escape and toward restoration. The strongest evidence cited by its supporters comes from the cultural background of the Greek term translated as meeting. Historical sources from the Greco-Roman world show that delegations often left a city to welcome a visiting dignitary before escorting him back to the city itself. Some scholars argue that Paul's audience, living within the Roman Empire, would have immediately recognized this imagery. The difficulty, however, is that linguistic parallels do not automatically determine theological meaning. Critics note that words can function differently depending on context. Similar vocabulary does not necessarily prove identical intent. Others raise a second objection. If Paul intended to describe a royal arrival rather than a heavenly departure, why does he not explain the symbolism more explicitly? This question remains one of the central points of debate. Yet there is an even more controversial interpretation hidden within the history of Christian thought. Some theologians have suggested that much of the modern rapture framework emerged relatively late when compared to earlier Christian traditions. According to this perspective, the detailed expectation of believers being removed from the earth before a future tribulation became especially influential in certain theological movements during the 19th century. Advocates of this view argue that earlier Christian writers generally emphasized resurrection, judgment, and the renewal of creation rather than a separate removal of believers from the world. Others remain unconvinced by this argument. They contend that while later theology may have systematized these ideas, the essential foundations can still be found within the biblical text itself. The debate, therefore, becomes more complicated than a simple choice between ancient and modern interpretations. It becomes a question of continuity. Did later traditions clarify what was already present in the earliest writings, or did they reshape those writings through new theological lenses? The historical record does not provide an easy answer. Evidence exists on multiple sides of the discussion. Each interpretation solves certain textual puzzles while creating others. What makes these readings so fascinating is not merely that they disagree. It is that they reveal fundamentally different visions of Christian hope. One imagines deliverance through departure. Another imagines deliverance through transformation. One focuses on leaving the present world behind. The other focuses on the arrival of a renewed world. And as we continue examining the evidence, we begin to realize that the debate may ultimately concern something far deeper than the mechanics of the end times. It concerns the very meaning of redemption itself. At this stage of the investigation, we have gathered fragments of evidence from ancient texts, linguistic clues, historical contexts, and theological traditions. Yet the central question remains unresolved. What exactly did the earliest Christians believe would happen when Christ returned? The difficulty is that the surviving evidence allows for more than one interpretation. And because intelligent scholars continue to disagree, our task is not to choose a side prematurely, but to examine the competing theories as fairly as possible. The first interpretation is perhaps the most familiar. According to this view, often associated with various forms of dispensational theology, the rapture describes a future event in which believers are removed from the earth before a period of divine judgment known as the tribulation. Supporters of this theory point to Paul's description of believers being caught up in the clouds to meet the Lord. They argue that the upward movement is central to the passage. They also connect this event with other prophetic texts, constructing a broader timeline in which God temporarily removes the faithful before final judgment unfolds. The strength of this interpretation lies in its internal coherence. It provides a structured explanation for numerous prophetic passages and offers a clear distinction between the destiny of believers and the fate of the world during the final crisis. Yet critics argue that the theory depends upon combining multiple texts that may not have originally been intended to function as a single chronological system. They also note that Paul never explicitly states that believers remain in heaven after meeting Christ. This leads us to a second interpretation. According to many contemporary biblical scholars, the event described in 1 Thessalonians is better understood through the lens of ancient royal processions. In this reading, believers rise to greet the returning king and then accompany him as he completes his arrival. The focus is not on departure but on welcome, not on escape but on inauguration. Supporters point to linguistic parallels, historical customs, and the broader New Testament emphasis on resurrection and the renewal of creation. They argue that this interpretation aligns more naturally with the imagery of the New Jerusalem descending from heaven rather than humanity permanently ascending away from earth. Yet this view also faces challenges. Critics question whether the cultural background is sufficient to establish Paul's intended meaning. Others argue that the interpretation may understate the dramatic supernatural elements present in the text itself. There is even a third perspective held by some theologians who view much of the language symbolically. They suggest that the passage communicates profound theological truths about resurrection, divine victory, and ultimate union with Christ without necessarily providing a literal sequence of future events. The strength of this approach is its sensitivity to the symbolic character of apocalyptic literature. Its weakness is that some readers feel it risks dissolving historical expectation into metaphor. The evidence therefore points in multiple directions. Each interpretation possesses explanatory power. Each encounters difficulties. One emphasizes deliverance before judgment. Another emphasizes the arrival of divine kingship. A third emphasizes symbolic theology over predictive chronology. None can simply be dismissed, and perhaps that is what makes this debate so enduring. The question is not merely which theory is correct. The deeper question is whether the earliest Christians were primarily expecting to leave the world behind, or whether they were expecting the world itself to be transformed when heaven and earth finally met. As historians, there comes a moment in every investigation when we must leave the realm of ideas and descend into the physical world. Manuscripts can be copied. Traditions can evolve. Interpretations can change. Stone is more difficult to persuade. Archaeology does not tell us what ancient people believed with perfect certainty, but it often reveals the world in which those beliefs were formed. When we search for archaeological echoes related to the rapture, we immediately encounter an important limitation. There is no surviving inscription, no buried artifact, no ancient monument that directly describes the event later generations would call the rapture. The archaeological record cannot confirm or deny the doctrine itself. Yet it does preserve fragments of the environment that gave rise to the texts at the center of this debate. One of the most important discoveries comes from the deserts surrounding the Dead Sea. Hidden for nearly 2,000 years within caves near Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal a Jewish world saturated with apocalyptic expectation. These manuscripts predate Christianity, yet they contain visions of divine judgment, cosmic conflict, heavenly intervention, and the ultimate restoration of God's people. They do not describe a rapture. However, they provide valuable evidence for the intellectual atmosphere from which early Christian apocalyptic thought emerged. The scrolls function not as proof, but as historical context. They remind us that the language of divine arrival and cosmic transformation already existed before the New Testament was written. A second echo emerges from the cities visited by Paul himself. Archaeological excavations at Thessalonica, Corinth, and Ephesus reveal thriving urban centers deeply integrated into the Roman world. Marble roads, imperial monuments, public forums, and ceremonial gateways still stand among the ruins. These cities were not isolated religious communities. They were places where imperial ideology surrounded daily life. Statues of emperors dominated public spaces. Civic ceremonies celebrated the arrival of rulers and dignitaries. Some scholars suggest that this cultural background may illuminate Paul's language about meeting the Lord. The archaeological evidence does not prove this interpretation. Yet it demonstrates that ceremonial welcomes for powerful figures were part of the social landscape familiar to his audience. Another intriguing source of evidence comes from early Christian funerary art. Catacomb paintings, sarcophagi reliefs, and inscriptions frequently emphasize resurrection rather than escape from the earth. Images of Jonah emerging from the great fish, Lazarus raised from the tomb, and Christ conquering death appear repeatedly. These visual traditions cannot settle the rapture debate. They do, however, suggest that many early Christians focused intensely on resurrection hope. Whether that hope implied ascent to heaven, the renewal of creation, or some combination of both remains a matter of interpretation. The archaeological record also preserves silence. No first-century Christian inscription clearly outlines a detailed rapture chronology. No surviving church building from the earliest period contains artwork depicting believers disappearing before a tribulation. Such absence does not disprove later interpretations, but historians must acknowledge it. Silence itself becomes part of the evidence. What archaeology ultimately offers is not a direct answer, but a series of echoes. Fragments of manuscripts hidden in desert caves. Ruined cities shaped by imperial ceremony. Tomb inscriptions expressing confidence in resurrection. Together they reconstruct the cultural memory of a world waiting for divine intervention. Yet they stop just short of resolving our central question. They show us the stage upon which the drama unfolded. They illuminate the scenery, the language, and the expectations. But the meaning of the final act remains open to interpretation. And perhaps that is why the debate has endured for centuries, suspended between what the stones can reveal and what the texts continue to inspire. To understand why the return of Christ occupied such a central place in early Christian thought, we must temporarily set aside modern debates and enter the intellectual universe of the ancient world. The question before us is not whether their expectations were correct. The question is what those expectations meant within the framework of their worldview. The historical record suggests that the first Christians inherited a vision of reality profoundly different from many assumptions common today. They did not view history as an endless cycle without direction. Nor did they generally imagine the material world as something inherently evil that needed to be abandoned. Instead, many early Jewish and Christian texts describe history as a story moving toward a divinely appointed resolution. Creation had a beginning, therefore it would also have a culmination. Within this framework, the return of Christ was not simply an event. It was the moment when the hidden meaning of history would finally be revealed. This theological perspective helps explain why resurrection occupies such a prominent place in early Christian writings. To modern readers, resurrection is often treated as one doctrine among many. To ancient believers, it stood at the center of the entire narrative. Death represented the ultimate enemy. Empires rose and fell. Armies conquered nations. Disease swept through cities. Yet death remained undefeated. The significance of Christ's return was therefore inseparable from the expectation that death itself would eventually be overcome. This raises an important observation. In many ancient texts, salvation is not primarily described as escape from the physical world. Rather, it is portrayed as the restoration of a damaged world. The strongest evidence for this perspective appears in themes repeated throughout Jewish apocalyptic literature and the New Testament: resurrection, judgment, renewal, and the establishment of divine justice. The expectation was not merely that individuals would survive death. It was that creation itself would be transformed. Some scholars argue that this theological framework supports interpretations emphasizing renewal over departure. Others caution that the evidence is complex and does not eliminate alternative readings. Yet regardless of where one stands in the debate, the broader worldview remains significant. The ancient concern was not simply where believers would go. The deeper concern was what kind of reality would emerge when God's purposes were finally fulfilled. This distinction is crucial because it reveals a very different understanding of heaven and earth. In many biblical texts, heaven is not merely a distant location. It represents God's sphere of authority and presence. Earth represents the realm of human history. Theological hope often centers on the reconciliation of these two realms rather than their permanent separation. This may explain why visions of divine descent appear so frequently alongside images of human ascent. The symbolic movement works in both directions. Heaven reaches toward earth even as humanity reaches toward heaven. From this perspective, the return of Christ becomes more than an event on a prophetic timeline. It becomes the culmination of a cosmic drama concerning order and chaos, life and death, justice and corruption. Theological significance, therefore, extends beyond questions about chronology. It touches the deepest assumptions ancient people held about reality itself. What is the purpose of history? Can evil ultimately be defeated? Is death the final authority over human existence? These were the questions that gave meaning to apocalyptic expectation. And perhaps the most revealing insight is that early Christians were not merely waiting for the future. They believed they were already living within the final chapter of a story whose ending had begun with the resurrection of Christ. Whether one accepts that belief or not, understanding it is essential to understanding why the return of Christ carried such extraordinary significance in the ancient imagination. As our investigation approaches its deepest layer, the debate about the rapture begins to reveal itself as something larger than a theological disagreement. Beneath the arguments about texts, symbols, and prophetic expectations lies a more ancient question. A question that appears wherever human beings become aware of their own mortality. What becomes of us when the visible order of things reaches its limit? The people who first contemplated the return of Christ lived in a world where death was never far away. Plagues swept through cities. Wars altered the fate of nations. Children died young. Empires that appeared eternal eventually collapsed into memory. In such a world, the question of endings was not a philosophical luxury. It was woven into everyday existence. Yet what makes the ancient apocalyptic imagination so remarkable is that it did not merely ask how the world would end. It asked whether ending itself was the final truth about reality. The historical record suggests that many ancient thinkers understood existence as a tension between permanence and decay. Great temples rose from stone only to weather beneath centuries of wind. Kingdoms expanded across continents only to fragment into dust. Human life appeared fragile when measured against the vastness of time. From this observation emerged one of the deepest anxieties in ancient thought. If everything eventually passes away, can anything possess lasting meaning? It is here that apocalyptic visions acquire their philosophical significance. Their purpose was not simply to predict future events. They attempted to answer a more profound problem: whether history itself was moving toward chaos or toward fulfillment, whether death represented the ultimate horizon of existence or merely a boundary beyond which another reality awaited. The evidence suggests that early Christian expectations emerged within this broader search for meaning. Yet the answers they offered remained intertwined with mystery. Even the most vivid descriptions of resurrection, judgment, and divine return employ symbols rather than direct explanations. This may reflect an important intellectual humility. Ancient authors often recognized that ultimate realities could not be fully captured by ordinary language. The clouds, trumpets, visions, and heavenly encounters functioned not as complete descriptions, but as approximations pointing beyond themselves. This raises a deeper question about the limits of human knowledge. Throughout history, people have sought certainty regarding the unseen world. They have searched for maps of heaven, timelines of the future, and explanations for what lies beyond death. Yet the closer one examines the surviving texts, the more one encounters ambiguity alongside conviction. Hope exists alongside uncertainty. Expectation coexists with mystery. Perhaps this tension is not a flaw within the tradition but part of its intellectual structure. The desire to understand transcendent realities repeatedly encounters the boundaries of human comprehension. Theological language stretches toward truths that remain partially hidden. In this sense, the debate surrounding the rapture reflects a larger feature of the human condition. We seek to know what lies beyond the horizon while standing firmly within it. We construct symbols because direct knowledge remains elusive. We interpret signs because certainty remains incomplete. The philosophical significance of these ancient expectations may therefore lie not only in the answers they provide, but in the questions they preserve. Questions concerning mortality, destiny, meaning, and the possibility that reality contains dimensions not immediately visible to human perception. The ancient world left many different responses to these questions. Yet all of them emerged from the same fundamental encounter: the realization that human beings inhabit a universe vast enough to inspire wonder, fragile enough to provoke fear, and mysterious enough to resist final explanation. And it is within that tension between knowledge and mystery that the enduring fascination of apocalyptic thought continues to reside. After following the evidence through ancient manuscripts, ruined cities, symbolic language, theological traditions, and competing interpretations, we arrive at the point where every serious historical investigation must eventually arrive, not at certainty, but at judgment. The question that guided this journey was deceptively simple. What does the Bible actually say happens at the event commonly called the rapture? Yet, as the evidence accumulated, the question itself began to change. What initially appeared to be a debate about a future event gradually revealed itself to be a debate about how the earliest Christians understood reality itself. The historical record establishes certain facts with reasonable confidence. The earliest Christian communities expected the return of Christ. They believed the dead would be raised. They anticipated a decisive act of divine intervention within history. They employed imagery of clouds, trumpets, heavenly assemblies, and cosmic transformation to describe that expectation. These foundations are well attested within the surviving texts. The greater difficulty emerges when we ask how those images were intended to function. Here the evidence becomes more complex. Some scholars argue that the language points toward the removal of believers from the earth before a period of judgment. Others contend that the same language is better understood as a public reception of a returning king whose arrival inaugurates the restoration of creation. Both interpretations draw upon genuine textual evidence. Both attempt to make sense of the same passages. Yet when the broader landscape of early Jewish apocalyptic thought, resurrection theology, and New Testament imagery is considered together, a pattern begins to emerge. The strongest evidence suggests that the earliest Christian hope may have been less concerned with escaping creation than with witnessing its renewal. This conclusion remains open to debate. Intelligent scholars continue to disagree regarding important details. The archaeological record cannot fully resolve the question. The manuscripts do not eliminate every ambiguity. Yet when viewed as a whole, the surviving evidence repeatedly directs attention toward resurrection, restoration, divine kingship, and the ultimate reconciliation of heaven and earth. This observation leads us to what may be the deepest revelation hidden beneath the debate itself. The central issue was never merely movement through space. It was the transformation of reality. The clouds, the trumpet, the ascent, the heavenly encounter. All of these symbols appear to revolve around a single theological claim, that history is not abandoned. It is brought to completion. Whether one interprets the rapture as a distinct event or as part of a broader vision of divine return, the recurring theme remains remarkably consistent. The final hope concerns the defeat of death and the restoration of order within creation. My reading of the evidence is therefore cautious but clear. The earliest Christian writings seem less interested in describing an escape route from the world than in proclaiming the arrival of a new order within it. The emphasis repeatedly falls upon resurrection rather than disappearance, renewal rather than abandonment, kingship rather than evacuation. Yet the debate remains open. The evidence supports strong conclusions in some areas and invites humility in others. Perhaps that is fitting. For the ancient authors themselves often wrote as individuals standing at the edge of mystery, attempting to describe realities that exceeded ordinary language. What survives in their texts is not a perfectly detailed map of the future. It is something more enduring, a vision, a conviction that history possesses meaning, that death does not possess the final word, and that the apparent fracture between heaven and earth is not permanent. Whether one approaches these ideas as a believer, a historian, or a curious observer, that may be the most profound revelation uncovered by our investigation. Not a prediction, but a worldview. Not merely a doctrine, but a way of understanding the destiny of creation itself. The oldest mysteries rarely disappear. They simply change shape as they pass from one generation to the next. We began this investigation with a question about the rapture. We examined ancient texts, traced forgotten traditions, weighed competing interpretations, and followed fragments of evidence scattered across centuries of history. Along the way, certain conclusions appeared stronger than others. Certain explanations seemed more consistent with the surviving record. Yet there remains a final threshold that historical analysis alone cannot fully cross. Beyond that threshold stands a question that haunted the ancient world long before Christianity emerged and continued to echo long after empires vanished into dust. It is the question that hides beneath every vision of resurrection, every image of divine return, every trumpet blast described in apocalyptic literature. Why did so many ancient people believe that history itself was moving toward a moment of revelation? The archaeological record can show us what they built. Manuscripts can preserve what they wrote. Theology can help us understand what they believed. But none of these can completely explain why the human imagination repeatedly returns to the idea that the visible world is not the whole story. Throughout our journey, one pattern has appeared again and again. The earliest Christian texts seem less concerned with predicting dates than with interpreting meaning. Less concerned with geography than destiny. Less concerned with the mechanics of heaven than with the ultimate fate of creation. Yet even if the strongest evidence suggests that many early Christians anticipated the renewal of the world rather than escape from it, another mystery remains. Why did later generations so often gravitate toward images of departure instead? Some scholars argue that changing historical circumstances reshaped how believers read ancient texts. Others suggest that the tension already existed within the texts themselves. The debate remains open, and perhaps it should remain open, because beneath the historical disagreement lies a deeper philosophical possibility. What if the enduring power of apocalyptic visions does not come from their ability to describe the future with precision, but from their ability to confront questions that ordinary history cannot answer? Questions about whether justice ultimately triumphs over corruption, whether death possesses final authority, whether the apparent disorder of the world conceals a larger order that remains unseen. The ancient authors believed these questions mattered enough to dedicate entire visions, prophecies, and theological systems to them. Yet they rarely claimed complete understanding. Their writings often end where certainty begins to fade into mystery. Symbols replace explanations. Visions replace diagrams. The horizon remains visible, but never fully reached. This may be the most revealing clue of all. The closer we move toward the edge of ultimate questions, the more language itself begins to struggle. Historians encounter the limits of evidence. Theologians encounter the limits of interpretation. Philosophers encounter the limits of reason. Beyond those limits stands a silence that no manuscript can entirely fill. And so our investigation ends where many ancient investigations ended, not with certainty, but with a carefully preserved question. If the earliest Christians truly expected the reunion of heaven and earth rather than the abandonment of one for the other, then what does that tell us about the way they understood reality itself? Were they describing a future event hidden somewhere beyond history? Or were they attempting to express a truth about existence that can only be approached through symbol, vision, and sacred imagination? The evidence leads us far, but not all the way, and perhaps that unfinished distance between what can be known and what can only be contemplated is the final mystery that the ancient texts were never trying to solve, but inviting us to enter.